we're going to take some time now to concentrate on or intensify our focus on the conditional. In symbolic logic, the conditional, that's the name of the connective that we use when we see language like if then, sufficient condition for, necessary condition for, and similar phrases. And it is the name of the connective that we translate into the horseshoe, also known as the material conditional. Now, you've probably already noticed that if-then statements are kind of slippery suckers. In other words, it's not always obvious how we're supposed to treat them from the standpoint of formal logic. So one of the things that we do, which you've already seen, is we will take language that makes sense to you and kind of crab walk our way to the meaning of the operator known as horseshoe. What we also do is think of the horseshoe from the standpoint of truth functionality as mirroring the concept of validity. That's why you get only a value of false on line 2 of the truth table. When the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, the horseshoe is false. But let's take a little bit of time now to look at ways in which there are some sentences, for example, that defy our expectations of, for example, row 4 or line 4 of the truth table, false antecedent, false consequent, true, horseshoe, as well as at some ways that we can think about the conditional claim as it appears in ordinary language. So, for example, we'll talk about sufficient conditions, necessary conditions, and joint necessary and sufficient conditions, which are also, by the way, translated with triple bar. So more on that in a little bit, but let's spend a little bit of time focusing on the concept of the conditional, as well as practicing with the notions of necessity and sufficiency. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about conditional statements in terms with which you're already familiar. In other words, we're going to talk about the truth functionality of the horseshoe. It's also known as the material conditional or the conditional. But we're also going to talk about the conditional in terms of causal relations, sufficient conditions, necessary conditions, joint sufficient and necessary conditions, as well as additional language. Well, it's not so much additional language, but language that is used also to translate an if-then sentence or a sentence that is constituted by the language of sufficiency and necessity into the propositional logic notation that we've learned. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we know that we define the horseshoe as follows. The horseshoe is false in one and one case only, and that is when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So if you look at the examples above, you'll get an idea of, from the standpoint of kind of pumping our intuitions about if-then sentences, how this plays out. So row 1, we have a true antecedent and a true consequent. If the Eiffel Tower is in France, then the Eiffel Tower is in Europe. The Eiffel Tower is in France is a statement that's true. The Eiffel Tower is in Europe is also a statement that's true. And we say that we treat the sentence as a whole and say that that's true when we say it's true that if the Eiffel Tower is in France, then it is in Europe. On the other hand, we don't say that the sentence, if the Eiffel Tower is in France, then the Eiffel Tower is in the United States, is true when the Eiffel Tower is in France is a true sentence, but the Eiffel Tower is in the United States is a false sentence. That's row 2. Now take a look at rows 3 and 4, because for some of us, those are also a little bit counterintuitive, particularly row 4. If the Eiffel Tower is in Germany, then it's in Europe. We say that that sentence is true because although it's false that it's in Germany and it's true that it is in Europe, if it is in Germany, it's in Europe. And then lastly, if the Eiffel Tower is in Ohio, then it is in the United States. Again, this may be the most discomforting of the rows where the material conditional, the horseshoe, comes out true, and that's because both the antecedent and the consequent are false, and we think, well, that's peculiar, right? So we'll say more about this intuition that you might have in a little bit, but let's first talk about how it is that these values how these values are what they are. In other words, why is it the case that in rows 2, 3, and 4, we have the values that we have? I think the first row is pretty uncontroversial. So let's talk a little bit about the thinking behind the horseshoe. So we typically think of conditionals as reflecting an inferential or causal relationship between the left side of the horseshoe and the right side of the horseshoe. But in truth functional logic, this is not the case. We can assert sentences like, if the grass is green, the sky is blue, which you and I wouldn't assert, but we can assert this sort of sentence in propositional logic notation and come up with a truth value for the horseshoe. And that's because there is the commitment based, as we'll see in just a moment, on the idea of validity to the view that the only time that the horseshoe is false is when the antecedent's true and the consequent is false. In other words, a conditional is true except in the case when the antecedent's true and the consequent is false. I think there's a typo here. Antecedent is true while the conditional is false, and that's not what should be written. So let me go ahead and make a quick note to self. I didn't notice it until just this second. Isn't that interesting how you will oftentimes put what you want in place of what's actually there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how this idea plays out. When we think about the material conditional, one of the ways that we can think about it is in terms of our natural understandings of what would make an if-then sentence false. So, for example, it's false to say if you live in Los Angeles County, then you live in New York. It's false to say if Barack Obama is president of the United States, then he is king of the world. We know this because the antecedent, respectively, you live in Los Angeles County, Barack Obama is president of the United States. These are true, while the consequent, you live in New York, Barack Obama is king of the world, is false. So these ordinary language examples kind of pump our intuitions about what makes the second row of the truth table false in terms of the horseshoe. Now consider the following. If you get an A on the exam, you get an A for the course. Under what condition would this statement be false? Well, you'd probably say that if I lied to you, right? So if I say, if you get an A on the exam, then you get an A for the course, and it turns out you get an A on the exam, but then you look at your transcript and you see that you didn't get an A for the course, you would say, oh my gosh, Mia lied to me, right? In other words, the antecedent's true, the consequent is false, the sentence as a whole is false, and that's because in this situation I was deceptive. We also think of, not also, because this is actually going back to what I had mentioned a couple minutes ago about the horseshoe's values mirroring the concept of validity. But in addition to what I just mentioned a moment ago, you can think of the values in a conditional claims truth table in terms of validity. We know that an argument is invalid when the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Similarly, when the antecedent's true and the consequent is false in a conditional claim, the conditional claim as a whole is false. So in formal logic, we use this notion of validity to inform the truth values of the horseshoe. Now let's say a little bit more about the other two rows. That's row 3 when the antecedent's false and the consequent is true. How is it the case that the horseshoe is still true? And then lastly, when both antecedent and consequent are true in row 4, the horseshoe comes out true. So it may seem counterintuitive to assert that a conditional is true when the antecedent's false and the consequent is true. In other words, we think that the antecedent is a sufficient condition for the conclusion, or sorry, for the consequent to obtain. In other words, we think that the antecedent is going to guarantee the consequent. Here again, I have a typo. Goodness, glory be. Let's fix that now. I'm not quite sure how I managed that, but all right. So I guess I probably was thinking consequent and typed in terms of the arguments, elements, premise, and conclusion. So we would think that a false antecedent would yield a false consequent. But remember, in a truth table, what we're doing is looking at possible values. So the question is not, does the antecedent yield a false consequent, but is the false antecedent and true consequent going to yield a true or false horseshoe? So consider the following. If Oswald didn't assassinate President Kennedy, someone did. In other words, if we say that it's false that Oswald assassinated President Kennedy, but it's true that someone assassinated President Kennedy, then what we're saying is that it's true that if someone didn't, or sorry, if Oswald didn't, someone did. In other words, just because the antecedent is false does not mean that the sentence, if this then that, is false. So when we say it's legally and generally accepted that the statement Oswald didn't assassinate President Kennedy is false, it's also known that someone did assassinate the president. So what we're trying to do when we say if Oswald didn't, someone did, is we're trying to understand the relationship between the false antecedent and the true consequent. And this comports with our common understanding of a conditional claim. So you probably notice that I keep going back and forth between the formal understanding of the conditional and our common sort of ordinary everyday ways of thinking about the conditional to kind of help you crab walk from the latter, our ordinary ways of thinking about if-then sentences, to the formal way of thinking about conditionals. Now, row 4, again, I mentioned, can feel a bit counterintuitive. But when we think about our ordinary ways of understanding false antecedents and false consequents, we typically come up with a true conditional. So if we say that it's false that it's raining and it's also false that it's wet, we would still say, if it's raining, then it's wet, is true because of the way that we think about what conditions would need to obtain for the sentence to be true. So if it were raining, right, now we're going into these counterfactual ways of speaking, but we would say that if it were raining, then we would have the guarantee of wetness. So that kind of pumps our intuition about this sufficiency and, about what would be a sufficient condition. Similarly, if Pierce College is in Santa Monica, then Pierce College is located on the coast. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Pierce College, which here again, another fun typo. You'd think I would have corrected this before starting to talk about it, but hey, let's correct my work together. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, Pierce College is actually located in the western San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles County. But Santa Monica, which is right on the ocean, is also in Los Angeles County. Santa Monica is on the coast. But so that if Pierce College is in Santa Monica, then it is on the coast. We know that it's false that it's in Santa Monica. We know it's false that it's on the coast. But if it is in Santa Monica, then it is guaranteed to be on the coast. So again, we're pumping some of our intuitions about what guarantees the truth of the conditional as a whole. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, wait a minute, I can come up with some cases where the antecedent's false and the consequent is false and the sentence as a whole is false. And if that's the case, then you're probably anticipating the ways in which some logicians say that the horseshoe should not be treated as a truth functional operator, and that in fact conditionals can't be properly treated truth functionally without losing some robustness of what the conditional means. So let me give you, by way of Ian Hacking's A Concise Introduction to Logic, really nice text, which I don't think is in print any longer, but a couple of examples to get you thinking about how it could be the case that a false antecedent and a false consequent can yield a true conditional, and how there are cases where a false antecedent and a false consequent yield a false conditional. In other words, a way in which a conditional does not match up with the truth functional interpretation. Okay, story one. In the nation of Boiro, there is an underground political party that plans to assassinate a large number of ministers of the government the day before an election is held. When this plot is discovered, everyone agrees that if an election is held, there will be civil disorder. Because of this fear, the election is postponed indefinitely until the underground movement is placated or defeated. There is no civil disorder. Story 2. In the nation of Tamba, there is a rather dictatorial regime that is interested in the permanent abolition of elections. In fact, because of current prosperity, the regime is fairly popular at present, despite its authoritarian character. Fearing a decrease in popularity in the future, however, the government wishes to induce a fear of elections, so it circulates the rumor that if elections are held, there will be civil disorder. This is simply a lie put out by the propaganda machine. It is an effective lie, however, and elections are not held and there is no civil disorder. Okay, so let's pull this set of examples apart. First, take a look at the second sentence in story 1. When this plot is discovered, everyone agrees that if an election is held, there will be civil disorder, right? So there is no election. An election is held is false. So let me go ahead and mark this up for us. It's false that an election is held. It's false that there is civil disorder, right? But everybody agrees, so it's true that if an election is held, there will be civil disorder. In the second example, elections are held is false. There will be civil disorder is false. But the rumor, so the rumor is false, right? It's a rumor precisely because it's a lie, right, put out by the propaganda machine. So it's false that if elections are held, there will be civil disorder because this is in fact a lie, right? Let me offer you another couple ways of thinking about this, not this particular story, but this situation where we have a false antecedent, a false consequent, and we're told in this case that the value is false, whereas in the value of the horseshoe, whereas in this case, this is the traditional understanding of the horseshoe, false antecedent, false consequent, true horseshoe. So here we have another set of examples that might help make sense of the hacking example. It's false that Pierce is in Los Angeles. It's false that it's in New York. And we would say it's false that if it's in Los Angeles, it's in New York. It's false that Boston is in New York. It's false that Boston is on the European continent, where I'm thinking of Boston as the city in Massachusetts, in New England, in the United States, right? And we would say it's false that if it's in New York, it's on the European continent. It's false that Melville wrote Hamlet. It's false that Melville wrote Death of a Salesman. Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. Arthur Miller wrote Death of a Salesman. And it's false that if he wrote Hamlet, Melville wrote Hamlet, then he wrote Death of a Salesman. Lastly, a dollar bill is constituted by 5 quarters. False. A dollar bill can buy dinner at a fancy restaurant. False, generally speaking. I suppose there could be some exceptions, but I think we both know that it's generally the case that a dollar isn't going to do that. And then we would say it's false that, a dollar, if we have a dollar constituted by 5 quarters, then we can buy dinner at a fancy restaurant. These are all cases of these outliers to the outliers from this truth functional notion of a conditional claim. But let's just remember that these just simply press us to think more about the nature of a conditional. In formal logic, we adopt the view that the conditional mirrors validity, such that if the antecedent's true and the consequent is false, the horseshoe is false. In all other cases, in the 3 other cases, true antecedent, true consequent, false antecedent, true consequent, false antecedent, false consequent, the horseshoe is still true. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the conditional in terms of language like causation, sufficient conditions, necessary conditions, and other ordinary language words and phrases that we translate into a horseshoe sentence. So this comes from another terrific introductory logic text, Patrick Hurley's A Concise Introduction to Logic. And Hurley writes, when the word cause is used in ordinary English, it is seriously affected by ambiguity. For example, when we say that sprinkling water on the flowers will cause them to grow, we mean that water is required for growth, not that water alone will do the job. Sunshine and the proper soil are also required. On the other hand, when we say that taking a swim on a hot summer day will cause us to cool off, we mean that the dip by itself will do the job, but we understand that other things will work just as well, such as taking a cold shower, entering an air-conditioned room, and so forth. So in the first case, when we say that sprinkling water on the flowers will cause them to grow, we're talking about sprinkling water as a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient. On the other hand, when we're talking about the water causing us to cool off, we're talking about a sufficient condition, but it's not necessary because other things work just as well. So what we'll do here is look at some exercises where we're trying to make sense of this notion of causation, as well as the related concepts of sufficiency and necessity. So what we'll do first is try to talk about cause in terms of what's intended, a necessary condition, a sufficient condition. And then in the second set of exercises, let's practice with the language that is using sufficiency, necessity, as well as the phrases and words implies that or unless, to determine what the translation should be. When we're dealing with conditionals, we oftentimes see the language of sufficiency, necessity, and joint necessary and sufficient conditions. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about what each of these pieces of terminology means and how it functions. We say that a sufficient condition is a happening that guarantees another happening. So, for example, eating a potato chip guarantees I have something in my stomach. You can reformulate this as follows: if I eat a potato chip, then I have something in my stomach. You can also talk about a sufficient condition in similar terms. We say that a sufficient condition for something, for some state of affairs, is a condition that, if satisfied, guarantees that state of affairs obtains. So notice the language. We're talking about a conditional, and if being satisfied. So my car starting guarantees there is gas in my car. If my car starts, then there is gasoline in it. Now, it's true that lots of times we claim that a condition is sufficient for something happening when in fact it's not a sufficient condition, but that's a separate story, right? What we're talking about here is just what the definition of a sufficient condition is, and then how we formulate that condition in terms of the language that we use. We talk about an event guaranteeing another event, or if thus and such happens, then something else happens. A necessary condition is a condition that must happen. In other words, a necessary condition is a happening without which another event will not occur. You do not graduate without completing the required number of courses. If you graduate, then you complete the required number of courses. Another way to formulate this idea is as follows: a necessary condition for something, for some state of affairs, is a condition that must be satisfied for that state of affairs to obtain. You must earn at least a C to pass this course. If you pass this course, you've at least earned a C. Notice where the necessary condition goes in the conditional claim. It goes in the then position, or what occurs after the word then. We also have joint necessary and sufficient conditions. And these, in terms of identifying actual necessary and sufficient conditions, is tricky to do. It's also oftentimes tricky to identify a sufficient condition alone, a necessary condition alone. But it's really good to think about, even if it's hard to identify them accurately in your daily life, it's good to know what they're supposed to look like. So a condition is both necessary and sufficient when it is both required and guarantees an event obtains. Completing all the required courses and being in good standing with the institution are required and guarantee you are eligible to graduate. Now look at the complicated series of if-then statements, and two if-then statements conjoined. If you both complete the required courses and are in good standing with the institution, then you are eligible to graduate. And if you are eligible to graduate, then you both complete all the required courses and are in good standing with the institution. So now let's practice a bit with these concepts. We're going to either look at the language in an exercise to determine the correct conditional relationship. Sorry, I can't speak. Or the correct translation into propositional logic notation. So first, we have a causal claim. And here we are told that his death was caused by electrocution. So in what way are we thinking about cause? Are we saying that the electrocution was necessary for the death, that the electrocution was sufficient to bring about the death, or that the electrocution was both necessary and sufficient? And when we think about cause of death, we're typically talking about a sufficient condition. So what is it that brought about or guaranteed the death? It could be the case that there would be other ways in which this individual could have died. We're not saying that the electrocution was necessary for the death. In other words, electrocution was not required for the death. Second exercise says, if there are clouds, then there is rain. When we have a standard if-then relationship, the if is said to be the sufficient condition, and the then, or what comes after the then, is said to be the necessary condition. So clouds will be the sufficient condition for rain, or that which is said to guarantee the rain. A body won't accelerate without the action of a force. When you see the word without or without which, we're talking about a necessary condition. So the action of a force is necessary for acceleration, or absent the action of a force, we won't have acceleration. If you want to think about it in terms of one of the argument forms that we studied, we could say that if the body accelerates, then there is an action of force. Oh, there's not an action of force, so we don't have acceleration. So the without tells us that the action of a force is necessary for the body to accelerate. Now, in this sentence, what we're not being told is that force also guarantees acceleration. Now, 4 is a little bit tricky. So what the claim here is that gravity causes a pen to drop. But is it the case that gravity is going to guarantee the pen drops? In other words, what is the question that's being asked? Is it the case that we're talking about a situation in which I'm holding a pen and gravity pulls the pen out of my hand and causes it to drop? Or is it the case that when I release the pen, at that point, gravity takes over? I think what we're saying here is that if the pen is dropped, then it must go to ground. In other words, the pen, if I hold it, stays in my hand. When I drop it, then it's going to be the case that gravity takes over. So it's I think both the intended as well as the physical condition, or sorry, it's both the intended as well as the physical cause understood as a necessary condition. Pouring wood on a fire causes the fire to extinguish. Here we're talking about one way in which the fire can be distinguished, right? So when we say pouring water on wood causes the fire to extinguish, we're saying that it's sufficient to bring about the extinction of the fire. We know that there are other ways that the fire can be extinguished. Turning the key in the ignition causes a car's engine to combust. The car's engine, under normal circumstances, is not going to combust without turning the key in the ignition. So we would say that the key turning in the ignition is a necessary condition. Is it also the sufficient condition? Does it guarantee that the ignition will combust? Well, under normal circumstances, we would say yes. In other words, as long as there's nothing wrong with the engine, then turning the key in the ignition would both guarantee and must be the case for the car's engine to combust. But is that what's meant here? It certainly seems to be the case that we're at least talking about a necessary condition. In other words, without turning the key, we're not going to have the engine combust. It's not entirely clear to me anyway that the intention of the sentence is to say that turning the key in the ignition guarantees that the engine will combust. But if that is the intention, then we're talking about both a necessary and sufficient condition. You can't take this job without relocating. Here again, we're talking about the word without, or the phrase without which, as indicating a necessary condition. Relocating is necessary for taking the job. She was arrested only if she committed the crime. Remember, only if represents a necessary condition. So we say if she was arrested, then she must have committed the crime. So committing the crime is the necessary condition. It was sunny today, but it wasn't warm. Now, we know that there's no overt language here about cause, only if, necessary condition, sufficient condition. So what are we saying? Well, if we're saying that it was sunny but not warm, we're saying that the sunshine was not a sufficient condition for the weather to be warm today, or for the temperature to be at such a number that we would call it warm. If you're not happy, I'm not happy, and if you're happy, I'm happy. Here we have a way of saying that your happiness is both necessary and sufficient as conditions for my happiness, right? So my not being happy seems to be dependent on your not being happy, and my happiness seems to be dependent on your happiness. Hence, my happiness is dependent on and guaranteed by your happiness. In other words, your happiness is a necessary and sufficient condition for my happiness. Now let's talk about how we can translate. And this is really helpful for us to do when we want to see the logical structure of a sentence. The sun shining is not sufficient for the temperature to be at 65 degrees or warmer. Now let's read through each of these because this might feel a little bit tricky. A says, if S, then it's not D. If the sun is shining, then it's not 65 degrees or warmer. Now that doesn't seem to be right. But what you might be fooled by is B. If it's not the case that the sun is shining, then it is the case that the temperature is 65 degrees or warmer. That's also not a correct notation for this sentence. C is correct. It's not the case that if the sun is shining, then we have degrees of 65 or warmer. So when we're denying a sufficient condition, what we're doing is we're denying that this sentence guarantees this conclusion, this consequent. Your happiness is necessary and sufficient for my happiness. Remember, triple bar is the notation, is the operator we use for the phrase necessary and sufficient. It's also what we use when we say you either have both or neither, or when we say that if you are happy, then I am, and if you are not happy, then I'm not happy. Relocating is a necessary and sufficient condition. In other words, if you take the job, then you've relocated, and if you've relocated, then you've taken the job. Unless you didn't commit the crime, you are arrested. Now, we typically translate unless with a wedge, right? So either you didn't commit the crime or you are arrested. That is logically equivalent to if you committed the crime, then you are arrested. That's A. Water is sufficient for putting out a fire. Water guarantees the fire goes out. That's the claim. So W is water is sufficient. F is putting out the fire. Unless you turn the key in the ignition, the engine starter does not work. So again, unless is typically translated with the wedge. So either you turn the key in the ignition, or it's not the case that the engine starter works, which is equivalent to if you don't turn the key, then the engine starter doesn't work. That's A. Being age 30 or older is a necessary condition for serving in the Senate. So I use T for being 30 or older and S for serving in the Senate. And if we're saying that age 30 or older is necessary, we're saying if you serve in the Senate, then you must be 30 or older. A body accelerates only if, again, a necessary condition. So we have the body accelerating only if there is an action of force. Only if. And we remember that only if goes on the right side of horseshoe. So we have a horseshoe F. And the last two, not being married is a necessary condition for being a bachelor. We know that a necessary condition is translated on the right side of the horseshoe. So not being married, not M, is the necessary condition for being a bachelor, which means if you're a bachelor, then it must be the case that you're not married. Being a bachelor implies you are a man but not married. Implies is the if part, right? So being a bachelor is the if part, and it implies that you are a man but not married. That's choice A. All right, so I hope that this focus on conditionals has been helpful to you. Please bear in mind that talking about conditionals is tricky stuff, but we have some tools at our disposal. We have some rules for translating. We have some rules for understanding the meaning of phrases like necessary condition, sufficient condition, phrases like only if. So use those even when it's the case that there's some confusion about meaning. It's really easy to get turned around. So use those rules as a guide to helping you make sense of tricky sentences.